Speaking of thankfulness, two more hostages released yesterday. Of course, so many still held. Axios reporting this morning that Israel is willing to hold back on possible invasions while these negotiations still move forward. We'll take whatever good news we can get out of this grim situation and story. But it's extraordinary that this terrorist group is holding people in their 80s, releasing these women and leaving their two husbands in their 80s behind.
Just so brutal.
Yeah, that's reportedly been the counsel from the United States government to Israel, too, is just wait a little bit. Let's see if we can get these hostages out before you go in. And Hamas did release two more civilians who'd been held for the last 2 weeks more now in Gaza. Two elderly women freed yesterday. They were handed over to Israeli Defense Forces, taken to the hospital, and then reunited with their families. The women's husbands, as Joe said, who are both in their 80s, are still being held captive. They were kidnapped from their homes when Hamas first attacked on October 7th. In a press conference just moments ago, one of the women, with the help of her daughter, shared details of her capture.
She's saying that many people, a swarm of people, came through the fence. The defense cost 2.5 billion shekels, and it didn't help even a little bit. My mom is saying that she was taken on the back of a motorbike with her body, with her legs on one side and her head on another side, that she was taken through the plowed fields with a man in front on one side and a man behind her, and that while she was being taken, she was hit by sticks by Shabab people. Until they reached the tunnels. There they walked for a few kilometers on the wet ground. There are a huge network of tunnels underneath. It looks like a spider web.
So this is the second hostage release since the war began. An American mother and daughter were freed on Friday. Still, Israeli officials believe more than 200 people remain captive inside Gaza. Hamas, Qatar, Egypt, and Israel have been negotiating a proposal to release a larger group of hostages in exchange for a steady flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. That's according to three officials familiar with the talks who tell the Wall Street Journal. Hamas, however, is demanding Israel allow fuel deliveries into Gaza, but Israel fears the terrorist group may divert the supply and use for their own military purposes or to launch attacks into Israel. Let's bring in NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel. He is live in Jerusalem this morning. Richard, what more do we know about the release of these two women, 179, 185, and this broader strategy by Hamas?
It feels like we're talking about Israel every day, which we are. But it doesn't feel like burnout. It feels like just progressive coverage. And we have a lot of clips to get to, but let's listen to the rest of this. With this correspondent out there, because he's out there on the ground. So what he's seeing, he has to sort of soften up for this audience that's very neocon and very anti-Palestinian. So let's listen.
In our press conference that we just heard, an 85-year-old woman, tough woman who just was released last night and is already speaking to reporters, describing her experiences, speaking through with the help of a family member. And she described how she was taken on the back of that motorcycle after Hamas fighters broke into her kibbutz, started looting. She was thrown on the back of this bike and then taken into these tunnels. She said she was kept there with other prisoners, that Hamas seemed well prepared. They had shampoo and other toiletries ready. They replaced and cleaned the toilets. That they chose not to discuss politics with her. She even shook their hands when she left, not because she liked them or enjoyed this experience, of course not, but because they treated her decently.
You see the softening of the language. I got more footage to show everybody. We're going to see the contrast when you're not on corporate media or you're not a part of a corporate entity. In this sense, where you're advocating it so publicly for one side. But I do have some more footage to kind of counter some of the things he's saying here.
So an extraordinary count of her ordeal. But of course, Israel says there are about 220 hostages who remain in Gaza, still in captivity, including the husbands of these two women. I know that negotiations to free more hostages are ongoing. There had been some hope yesterday to free a larger group, and those discussions are continuing through the mediation of Qatar and Egypt. Overall, the military and humanitarian situation is still heading toward escalation, with Israel continuing its airstrikes, talking about more than 400 targets struck in the last 24 hours in Gaza. And aid workers in Gaza say unless they can get that fuel in, of course, there is a concern that it will be diverted to Hamas. But aid workers from a variety of organizations are saying unless some fuel can get in, generators are going to run out of their reserve supplies at hospitals, and then incubators, respirators, other kinds of equipment will not be able to function. Diplomatic efforts underway. French President Macron arrived. So we are still seeing diplomatic activity, but so far no breakthroughs.
So, Richard, publicly anyway, the Biden administration is saying the IDF, Prime Minister Netanyahu, they make their own military decisions. At NBC, we're reporting behind the scenes, the Biden administration is advising Israel to hold back on its ground invasion, to get these hostages out first, and to get humanitarian aid in there. What's your sense of those negotiations, and how long will Israel really wait?
Well, I think we're seeing a bit of posturing here. If the Israeli military, if it wanted to go in and was fully determined that it needed to go in, it would. It would not listen to the United States. It would not be held back. If it had a plan and it felt that the time was right to execute it, it would go ahead. But I think the United States, as its closest ally.
So that's him soft telling us that in no way is Israel prepared for any sort of invasion into Gaza. That's them softly acknowledging us to the public. Let's listen a little more, because they talk about this a little more, then I'll start to play some of these counter items that I have here.
Is urging caution, is doing so in a way that is publicly acknowledged, that does give the Israeli government a little bit of breathing room, because the people here are angry. They are furious. They want to see a military response, and they want to.
The people are here are angry, are furious. So those innocent civilians are demanding bloodshed. The innocent civilians are demanding a genocide from their government. They've already killed something like 3 times the amount of people that was killed on October 7th. That's not enough. 3 times is not enough. But the innocent civilians is demanding blood. Okay, let's continue.
See it now. So now if this government can say, we are attacking, we are working, we are freeing some hostages, and our allies are pushing for time, it does give them a bit more space to come up with a plan. Because going into Gaza is not going to be easy. Just going back to this tunnel story where these hostages are being held. And I spoke to a senior Hamas official yesterday who said the hostages are being held in multiple locations. I personally have been in tunnels in Gaza. Not these fighting tunnels, in smuggling tunnels, but the entire Gaza Strip is flat. It's along the sea, so the ground is quite soft and sandy. And for years, Palestinians have been digging networks of tunnels, and they are extraordinarily deep. You have one tunnel leading to another. There are many different layers to them. It is an entire labyrinth.
It would be, in the words of Scott Ritter, they would be walking into a trap being slaughtered. I'm going to let this play a little more, and then I'll bring up this other receipt that I have here. But let's let him finish at least the reporting out there.
Under Gaza. So in order to deal with that, it is going to take not just 2 weeks of planning, like Israel's had right now in response to these attacks that took place on October 7th.
You notice how he's stuttering? You notice how he's stuttering? But it's just what the video I'm going to show you in just a second. It's just what Scott Ritter said on Garland Nixon show, where he said, like, these reservists, they're not prepared for any sort of fighting like this. Because you got to think about it. If you go into enemy territory, this is constant fighting. There's not like, oh, it's break time. It's constant fighting while you're there. So let's switch out to the other video. We're gonna come back to this because there's a lot of things that to play there on Morning Joe. And the reason, again, if you're brand new to the show or brand new to the network, the reason we use a lot of Morning Joe, because Morning Joe is the cable news show for the establishment. So what you're seeing, they're not talking to us. They're talking to the bigwigs. They're talking to the donors. That's who that show is for. So that's why it's important that we analyze that show, to a lesser degree, the Rachel Maddow show. And there might be a couple of other shows that I'm missing right now, but